In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit of grace. One of the greatest privileges in the life of a parish priest is that from time to time one is invited to share with people an experience either of great joy or of great sorrow. You might think it strange that I include both extremes of the human condition in the same breath. I'm speaking, of course, of the great transition points in human life, the imminent birth of a child, the joy of preparing for a baptism or for a marriage, but also of those other overwhelming experiences, the waiting by the bedside of a dearly loved parent or spouse, or the experience no parent should ever have to endure, the death of a child. And it seems to me that when these times of transition happen in our lives, there is often a sense of bewilderment, of not knowing quite what to do, a feeling of having been left alone to deal with an anxiety or a loss that nothing in our lives could prepare us for. A concern also that our expressions of care for one another might be inadequate. And in our life as a community, we go through other experiences of dislocation, when the direction of our lives seems unclear and the security we generally take for granted evaporates. As a parish, I guess we've been experiencing this during this last week. As in the middle of an unexpected COVID lockdown, many of us at the same time have been forced to evacuate as our homes have been threatened by bushfire. Perhaps our own emotions mirror the jumble of the physical signs we see around us, face masks and hand sanitizer, as well this last week as the whir of helicopter blades, the sirens of emergency vehicles, and flaky ash swirling like snow. Of course, we know that we will get through these things, and we are reminded of the importance of caring and praying for one another. I have felt supported over the last few days by the simple acts of care that many of you have shown me. But at other times of overload and uncertainty, our faith in God and also our faith in one another can be weakened. The fabric of our community of care can fray. Where is God for us? Is God leading us? Or even, as the people of Israel seem to be asking in the background of our first reading from the prophet Isaiah, does God even care? The prophet we speak of as second Isaiah is writing here to a community who have already survived war and captivity, a community on the brink of being released from exile, but who are tired and dispirited and anxious. After 70 or so years of suffering and exile, Israel no longer sees God's promises as trustworthy. God has come to seem remote and uninterested. And against this background, in Isaiah chapter 40, God himself speaks, which is to say, the prophet screws up all his courage and he dares to speak to the people in the persona and in the words of God. But it's a message more awe-inspiring than comforting. God reminds the people of their difference in perspective, talking to them as though they were naughty schoolchildren who have forgotten something that they should have learned back in grade 1. Do you not know? Have you perhaps forgotten? Our best efforts to understand the ways of God or of the world around us seem pretty feeble. Nothing we do is permanent. None of our achievements will last. Our plans and everything that we build are transient, gone in a moment. From God's perspective, we hop around pointlessly like grasshoppers. We get distracted by success, and we get distracted by grief. God points out the stars in the sky and reminds us who created them, who holds them in place. Just remember who created who, God says. Don't expect to see things from my point of view. Well, you might not be feeling a whole lot better at this point. But then comes the rest of the answer. Why do you suppose that I don't care? God asks. Because my strength is your strength, and it is my love that sustains you. That's more or less what God is saying in this reading. All you need to do is wait on me. But the Hebrew word that our Bible translates as waiting is worth thinking about, because this is a strong and reassuring word, kawah, meaning to wait for and to hope in. Itself comes from a root word that means twisting or plaiting a strand of rope. So waiting on God means allowing God to work on us, to braid us or to plait us into God's own strength and purpose for us. Even vigorous young athletes run out of puff. And that's how it is for us, for sure, whenever we try to depend on our own strength. But if you allow God's strength and God's wisdom to hold you up, then you will soar like an eagle. Reading this verse, I'm always reminded of that advertisement for the so-called energy drink. You know the one? Red Bull gives you wings. Apparently it's got about as much caffeine in it as 10 cups of coffee, not to mention guarana, whatever the heck that is. But by contrast, the image we have from the prophet Isaiah is not manic, but effortless. The way an eagle just hangs in the air, almost without moving a feather. It finds the thermals, and it just allows itself to be carried. Do nothing. Just wait and trust and allow God to work on you. Well, that's a pretty strong and encouraging picture, isn't it? Turn to God, says Isaiah, and God will give you the wings that will enable you to soar and ride out the storm, whatever happens, or wherever you find yourself in life. God will refresh and restore you. God will renew your strength and fill you with new energy. But how do you do that? Is that just spiritual jargon, turn to God? Or is it something you can actually do? In our gospel reading today, Jesus, I think, shows us exactly how. You see, the gospel reading that we just shared is part of the passage in chapter 1 of St. Mark's Gospel that some commentators call the long day at Capernaum. We actually started the long day in our gospel reading last week with Jesus teaching in the synagogue and healing the man possessed with a demon. Then straight after church, off to Simon Peter's house to heal his mother-in-law. A quick break for lunch and hopefully an afternoon nap, because as soon as the sun sets at the end of the Jewish Sabbath, the whole village is queued up at the front door. People to be healed, demons to be dispelled. It seems everybody wants something from Jesus. This is Jesus' busiest day ever. And taken as a whole, this day, this passage in Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, shows us why the kingdom that Jesus is proclaiming is good news. It's good news because people are being healed and people are being set free from what oppresses them. Jesus in his ministry is fulfilling here the promise of Isaiah. But I want to pick up just 2 points. Just 2 points in this jam-packed reading. And this is the first one. That Jesus heals people by touching them. He heals by showing compassion, by holding people, by taking them by the hand. And this is the ministry of healing with which Jesus also charges us as his disciples. God heals us by physical touch, by coming into our own community and touching us in the universal language of human care. Nothing more glamorous than that. And that is how we also are called to heal one another. Simon Peter's mother-in-law responds to the healing that she receives by getting up and making lunch. Simple acts of physical availability make us a part of God's own life, because that is what the Trinitarian life of God is all about. Pouring out God's own self in the service of the other. You know, there is an image of busyness in this passage from Mark's Gospel that we read. And more than that, there's also a hint, isn't there, of the emotional cost of compassion. St. Paul, in his, for my money, defensive sounding and somewhat over-busy description of his ministry among the people of Corinth that we heard in the reading from that letter this morning, St. Paul talks of being all things to all people, of pouring himself out so much in service and in love that what can be seen is not him any longer, but just the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, ministry in all its forms is certainly about radical availability that should always be self-sacrificial, always focused on God's love and compassion that we see in Jesus. But St. Paul's somewhat overactive essay on ministry looks to me anyway a bit more like the Red Bull advertisement than like the calm image of confidence and trust that we see in the prophet Isaiah. Ministry also needs its cycles of self-care. Well, after the longest day and evening at Capernaum, Jesus wakes up the next morning, I guess, feeling drained and tired. We all know what it's like to be worn out by emotions, whether our own emotions or the emotional demands of other people. Jesus must be feeling light-headed with tiredness. And so what does he do? But go right back to where he started, which is to say, right back into the desert to spend some more time alone in prayer. This tells us something fundamental about Jesus and about ourselves as well. Jesus needs to turn inwards, away from the desperation and the demands of human need, and back into the solitude that will bring him into focus and reconnect him with the source of healing and compassion. Take time out to allow God to plait you back into the rope of God's own life. Learn to be silent. Wait on God. Learn to listen. That's the first thing. There's something else that often gets overlooked, and it's that Jesus never did heal everyone who needed him. There were always so many others. I'm sure most of you will have seen the fabulous musical Jesus Christ Superstar, and that frantic image in the middle of the play when everybody wants something from Jesus and he is frankly overwhelmed. If you are in Capernaum, then you're not in Bethsaida, are you? If you're out praying in the desert, then there are people in the villages not being attended to. Can't you just imagine the clamour the next morning when it turns out Jesus has disappeared? Well, I brought my mum all the way here from Sidon, and what? You're saying he's taken the day off? Words to the effect. Jesus is no exception to the reality that on the human level, the needs that surround us are always too great. With respect to the great St. Paul the Apostles, you can't, in fact, be all things to all people. It strikes me that Jesus doesn't need to be needed. He just needs to be in touch with God and with God's priorities for his life. The point, I think, for we who are called to be Christ to one another is that our priority needs to be in touch with the source of what gives us life. Just stop, flapping our wings and wait for the thermal currents of God's own breath to lift us up. Allow ourselves to be healed, and we will be a source of healing and of peace for those around us. Amen.